Michelangelo signed exactly one sculpture in his life and regretted it 473 years later. A man broke that sculpture apart with a hammer, and inside the Madonna's ruined left hand, someone found a second mark. The Vatican announced it to the world, then it never mentioned it again. The contract was signed on the 27th of August, 1498. A French cardinal named Jean-Bilhers de Lagrolles wanted a marble Pieta for the chapel where he intended to be buried. The Virgin clothed, with the dead Christ in her arms, and the figure of Christ, the contract says, as large as a well-proportioned man. The price was 450 gold ducats, and the deadline was 1 year. The sculptor was 23 years old. He went to Carrara himself and chose the block. And everything you are looking at, 2 bodies, the folds, the whole thing, 1.75 meters tall and almost 2 meters across, came out of that one piece of stone. The cardinal died in the summer of 1499. He got a little over a year with it. Then comes the story that everyone tells. It comes from Giorgio Vasari, writing about 50 years afterwards. Vasari says Michelangelo was standing near his own sculpture, unrecognized, when he heard a group of visitors admiring it and crediting it to a different sculptor, Cristoforo Solari, a Milanese man with a good reputation. That night, Vasari says, Michelangelo came back with his chisel and cut his name into the band of cloth that crosses the Virgin's chest. Michelangelo Buonarroti, Florentine, was making this. And then Vasari says he was ashamed of himself. He had let vanity put his name on the Mother of God. He swore he would never sign another work. And across roughly 70 more years of carving and painting, hundreds of pieces, he never did. Take it as Vasari's story rather than as fact. The writer Miles Ungur has pointed out that the strap looks designed to carry an inscription, placed and angled as if the words were always meant to go there, which would make the mid-nitrage version impossible. Either way, the outcome is not in dispute. One signature, one work, everything else he made, he left unsigned. Pentecost Sunday, the 21st of May, 1972, around 11:30 in the morning, in St. Peter's Basilica. There was no glass, there was a railing, and behind it the sculpture, where anyone could get close enough to touch it. A 33-year-old man climbed over the railing. His name was László Tóth. He was a geologist, born in Hungary, living in Australia, and he had a geologist's hammer with him, a small, dense, purpose-built tool for splitting rock. He shouted that he was Jesus Christ, risen from the dead. Then he hit her 15 times. The people nearest him were tourists. One of them was a young American sculptor called Bob Castley, who was there on his honeymoon. He got to Tóth, hit him several times and dragged him off the statue. A fireman named Marco Ottaggio grabbed him by the hair. By then it was over. Here is what 15 swings of a rock hammer did. From the catalog, the restorers later compiled 15 fractures, 8 chips, 2 scratches, 3 cracks. Her nose broke into 3 pieces. Her left arm came off at the elbow, and the elbow itself shattered. Her left eyelid was gone, and so was part of the stone at the corner of her eye. There were scratches across her face and across the back of her neck. 15 swings, over in less time than it takes to read the list. It took 7 months to answer them. The floor of the chapel was covered in marble. How much marble is one of those small disagreements that never got settled. The Italian record of the restoration counts around 50 fragments. English language accounts say more than 100. Both numbers are in print, and nobody has reconciled them, which tells you something about how that morning actually went. Nobody was counting. They were picking things up off the floor of a basilica in front of a crowd, and some of that crowd put the pieces in their pockets. That is the detail I find hardest to shake. Within minutes of the most famous sculpture in the world being smashed, people were quietly taking parts of it home. Most of those pieces never came back. At least one did. Months later, an American who had been there posted his fragment back to Rome, anonymously, with no name attached. So when the work began, the first problem was not repair. It was inventory. A pile of marble chips, some of them barely bigger than a grain of rice, and no map of where any of them had come from. Identifying the fragments took 5 months, 5 of the 7, before a single piece was glued back on. Most of the time had already gone. The Vatican museums were run at the time by a Brazilian, Dioclesio Redig de Campos, and he handed the job to the man who ran scientific research there, Vittorio Federici. Remember that name. Before anyone touched the stone, there was an argument, and it was not a technical one. It was about honesty. One school of thought, the dominant one in Italian conservation, built by Cesare Brandi, who founded the National Restoration Institute in Rome, says the repair should stay visible. Fill the gap so the eye can read the shape, but let anyone looking closely see where the original ends and the modern hand begins. Damage is part of an object's history. Hiding it is a kind of lie. The other school says, integrate, make it whole, make the join invisible. Redig de Campos argued for the second, and his reasoning was specific to this sculpture. The Pieta, he said, takes most of its force from the sheer purity of its marble. The unbroken surface is the effect. A single scratch across that face disturbs you more than the missing arms of the Venus de Milo ever have. On a ruin, absence reads as time. On this, it would just read as injury. He won. They went for the invisible repair. So stainless steel pins, set at an angle inside her forearm, to hold it back onto the elbow. Polyester resin, pumped in through fine plastic tubes, so it reached the fracture without being spread across the surface. Filler made from Carrara marble, ground to different grits, and tinted with colored stone dust, until it matched the pale ochre of the original. 3 small prosthetic parts, 2 for the left nostril, 1 for the eyelid, made deliberately from a synthetic material a future restorer could remove without harming anything. And one detail I keep thinking about. The hammer had left a smear of oily blue paint under her left eye, off the tool itself. They lifted it away with adhesive tape, a layer at a time, so as not to disturb the surface underneath. Brandi, the man whose doctrine had just lost the argument, looked at the finished work and called it prudent, respectful and reversible. None of it would have worked without a favor done by a stranger 28 years earlier. In 1944, with the war still on, a man named Francesco Mercadali made a plaster cast of the Pieta. That is an ordinary thing to do. Museums cast famous sculptures. It is how copies get made, how details get studied, how a record gets kept in case something happens. Something happened. In 1972, that cast became the only complete, accurate record of what the sculpture had looked like before the hammer. Every missing piece was measured against it, and there is one use of it that is almost too neat to be true. Her left eyelid was gone, and there was nothing left to copy. So they went to the cast, took a silicone mold of the undamaged right eye, and used it to work out the exact dimensions of the missing left one. Her own face supplied the measurements for the part of her face that no longer existed. The man mixing plaster in 1944 had no idea he was making the blueprint for a nose that had not yet been broken. In December 1972, about 6 months after the attack, the Vatican announced something that had nothing to do with repairing anything. The Madonna's left hand is open. It is the quietest gesture in the whole sculpture. She is not holding her son, she is presenting him, palm turned outward and up. When the hammer came down, that hand broke and the fingers came off. And for the first time in almost 5 centuries, somebody had that palm in front of them, off the statue, in a laboratory under a good light. Vittorio Federici, the same man running the restoration, examined it and concluded that the lines in the palm were not only lines. Cut into them, he said, was a letter. An M. The New York Times put it on the front page. On the 1st of December, 1972, a secret signature found by accident in the one work Michelangelo had ever signed, and then spent his life regretting. What the M means, nobody could say. Michelangelo, Maria, both at once, which would be very like him. The Vatican said a detailed report was coming. It said photographs of the mark would be released later. No report was ever published. No photographs were released. And the full Italian technical account of the restoration, the one that lists the pins and the resin, and the grit sizes of the marble dust does not mention the M at all. So there are two honest possibilities, and no way to choose between them from here. Either Michelangelo really did cut a small mark into the Virgin's palm, in a place where no visitor would ever stand close enough to see it, and it has simply never been properly documented, or Federici and his colleagues looked at the creases of a carved hand under a strong lamp, saw a shape, said so out loud, and later, quietly, decided they had been reading the marble. Both of those are ordinary human outcomes. Only one of them got a front page. The rest of the schedule is precise, because the rest of it was documented. Laboratory work finished on the 7th of October, 1972. By the 21st of December, the repair was essentially complete, and Pope Paul VI came to look at it. On the 25th of March, 1973, the Pieta went back on public display, and Paul VI had done one more thing. He gave Italian state television exclusive permission to film the entire restoration, start to finish. That documentary went on to reach the Academy Award shortlist, the first time Italian television had managed it. Which leaves this. On the repair, they let a camera crew into the room for 7 months. On the mark in her palm, they promised a piece of paper and never produced it. One more thing they did, and this is the part that changes how the whole restoration reads. Behind her neck, where the hammer had scratched her, they deliberately left small gaps unfilled. Not missed, left. A visible memory of the damage, put there on purpose by the people who had just spent 7 months, making everything else disappear. The invisible restoration chose exactly one place to be visible. When she came back in 1973, she came back behind bulletproof glass, and she has never come out from behind it since. That is the change most people miss. For 474 years, you could walk up to this sculpture. Pilgrims touched it. In 1964, it was shipped across the Atlantic to the New York World's Fair, insured for $6 million, in a crate of about 6 tons, packed with 400 pounds of foam, and fitted with a locator beacon, built so that if the ship went down in mid-ocean, the crate would float. Afterwards, the Pope ruled it would never travel again. 8 years later, a man got over a railing with a hammer, and the distance became permanent. In 2024, before the Jubilee year, the Vatican replaced the barrier again. 9 new shatterproof panels, chosen for maximum transparency, with the whole chapel relit. Better glass so that you can see her more clearly, which is a strange sentence to have to write. As for the 2 men, László Tóth was never tried. He was held in an Italian psychiatric hospital for about 2 years, deported to Australia in January 1975, and after that, he simply disappears from the record. He died in 2012. Bob Cassilly, the sculptor on his honeymoon, went home to St. Louis and built a museum out of salvaged industrial junk, the sort of place children climb through, which now draws around 700,000 visitors a year. He died in 2011, so there are 2 marks on this sculpture. One of them you can see. It runs across the Virgin's chest in clear Latin capitals, and it is there because a young man overheard a stranger give his work to somebody else and could not stand it. He was ashamed of that signature for the rest of his life. The other one nobody can show you. It was announced on the front page of the New York Times, in the palm of a hand that had just been broken off a statue, and then it was allowed to go quiet. No report, no photograph, no correction either. And the only reason anyone is arguing about a mark in her palm is that a man decided to break her hand open. If the hammer had never come down, that hand would still be 5 centuries deep in shadow, out of reach behind 9 sheets of glass, and the question would never have been asked at all. There is one place you can still see the damage, if you know to look for it, behind her neck, where they chose not to fill it in. Michelangelo, by the way, took a hammer to a Pieta himself, his own in Florence late in his life, and he broke it badly. But that is a different story, and he had his reasons.